Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, I figured we'd talk a little bit about the situation in Alberta, being as I am an Albertan, and I think that there's a lot of misinformation going around, particularly from a lot of journalists in central Canada who are kind of taking everything at face value. And I think that's not really helping the situation. So let's unpack some of what's going on. So I think the first thing we need to remember is that there really is not a credible Western separatist movement happening. It's a few loudmouths, it's a few swivel-eyed loons, and they're being taken way too seriously by credulous journalists who don't really know better. So that's really the first thing to remember. Jason Kenney and in certain respects Scott Moe, who is the Premier of Saskatchewan, are raising these as kind of, here's the danger if you don't give us what we want, but it's a fairly empty threat. Like I said, there's no credible movement, and if you even talk to scholars who study separatist movements, there are none of the precursors in Alberta that you would find in any other separatist movement. They were not a country previously. They don't have a separate language or religion or cultural identity. They don't have separate sports teams. They don't have any of the kinds of things that make a separatist movement happen. So let's just get that on the table there, first of all, and, call a spade a spade. They are using this threat simply as leverage, and it's not really a credible one, but there are not enough people who really necessarily understand that fact. The next thing that we should think about is this talk about the level of anger in Alberta. This is partially true. There are angry people there, but a lot of that is stemming from the kind of economic anxiety of a major industry that is going through a period of transition. There's a lot of blame being cast around, particularly to the federal government, in terms of, you're killing the industry with regulation and so on, but that's not really the case. This is largely about the world price of oil, and the world price of oil is depressed because there is a global supply glut. So it doesn't make sense for either the Alberta or the federal government to scrap all kinds of regulations in order to crank open the taps, because there's already too much supply in the market, and that will just depress prices even further. So we need to get that, first of all, on the table, that this is a global issue. This is not a Canada or a North America issue. The issues around the bottlenecking of transport is largely twofold. First is the fact that part of why it's bottlenecked now is because more production has come online before there was capacity to transport it. The other thing is that there are already pipeline projects in the works. There are 3 that are being constructed right now. There's the Enbridge Line 3, there is the Keystone XL, and there is the Trans Mountain expansion. All of those have different challenges that are completely out of the hands of the Canadian government. Enbridge Line 3 and Keystone XL have their own challenges in the US with their own procedures down there. That's nothing the Canadian government can do anything about. Keystone XL, even with the full backing of the Trump administration, is still having its own particular court hurdles. That's still likely to go through based on everything I've heard, but it's just taking a lot longer. When it comes to Trans Mountain, the responsibilities of the federal government have largely been discharged. They went and redid the portions of the environmental assessment that the Federal Court of Appeals said were deficient, and they engaged in a whole new series of consultations with the affected First Nations in the areas along it. And there are other challenges ongoing at the courts related to that consultation process. Those are going to be very narrowly focused when they are heard, which should be shortly. And I suspect, given the amount of rigor that the federal government put on it and the fact that they got a former Supreme Court justice to shepherd that process, I think is going to mean that that is likely to go ahead. They've already been hiring, they've already got pipe going in the ground in the next week or two. So this is a project that is underway. So demanding more pipelines isn't really going to help. The other thing that we need to remember there is that if once those three projects are up and running, there isn't going to be excess capacity in the system for yet more pipelines. So we need to try and remember that in the kind of rhetoric that's being thrown around right now. The other thing that we're hearing a lot about is equalization. And we talked about this in last week's video, but we're going to reiterate it again in that there's a lot of myths about equalization that are being thrown around and are being stoked deliberately by people like Jason Kenney and Scott Moe, in that they're describing a system that is not how it actually works. Provinces do not pay into equalization. There is no check that goes to Ottawa for equalization. Equalization is a federal program that comes out of federal revenues. That means all of your income taxes and corporate taxes go into general revenue, and that gets redistributed as part of equalization. So you can't say that Alberta is paying more into it than other provinces. What that's actually meaning is that Albertans have the highest incomes in the country, by far the highest incomes, even in these economically depressed times there. And that means they pay more income tax as a result. But nobody wants to say that because you can't make people angry when you're pointing out that they're making more money than everyone else. Kind of how it works. We have seen some calls for equalization reform because Scott Moe in particular wants the federal government to pay them. And that's not how the system works. The system is about fiscal capacity, how much you are able to raise based on your economy. And they keep pointing to Quebec being a net receiver because they don't have the same kind of developed industries that Alberta or Saskatchewan has, which may be resource-based, but if you removed resources from the equation, like some people call for, then Quebec would get even more equalization. So it's kind of self-defeating if that's, what your target is. There's also this narrative that, Quebec is willing to take their money, but they're not willing to support the industry, based on this mythology around the Energy East pipeline. And the other thing we need to remember with that project is that it was kind of just an idea being floated around when Keystone XL was blockaded by the Obama administration. And because it's the same proponent and it was a different route to Tidewater that they figured they could repurpose existing pipeline for and then build new ones going the rest of the distance. The problem with that is that when Keystone XL came back into the picture as being viable again, there was not enough capacity or service contracts that could manage both pipelines. So they decided that Keystone XL was the one that they were going to go ahead with, and the other project was basically abandoned. And that's just as well. There's been this mythology that it was because of the increased regulatory hurdles that the National Energy Board was going to put on it. That may have been what the National Energy Board was going to look at, but Cabinet had already decided what their criteria were, and though the upstream emissions were not part of that. And that was perfectly laid out, so it's a bit of a misnomer to say that that was the reason why. Quebec will say that, we stopped that pipeline because we protested and that wasn't it at all. But that's feeding into this narrative in Alberta that, you'll take our money, but you won't take you won't support our industry. That's not really what happened. And if we keep persisting in fueling this narrative, then we're just inflaming tensions that really don't need to be inflamed. And that's part of why I think we need to just kind of dial everything back and put facts on the table and realize that, a lot of this anger is misplaced, and a lot of the blame is absolutely misplaced, and we need to just kind of calm down, talk this out rationally. That doesn't mean that those anxieties aren't real. They are. And we need to have ways to address that. And that's going to involve a lot of supporting these workers as they transition to different industries. That's kind of what's happening right now. I mean, the oil industry itself is changing. New jobs coming online are more about automation and AI than they are about the same kinds of physical labor that used to be. So we have to keep that in mind, that we can't go back to the industry that was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. That's gone. We have to transition to new ways of doing things. And that's not saying shut down the entire industry right away, because that's not feasible and that's not going to happen. But when the industry itself changes, the workforce has to change with it. And governments need to be better about addressing that and making plans to ease that transition along. But simply blaming the federal government and pretending that if you just scrapped all these regulations that the industry would come roaring back is not going to happen. You'd have to undo the shale boom in the US for anything approaching that to happen. And that's just not where the future's headed. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.